gray sky above Hamilton Ridge didn't bring rain, but its shade was enough to let anyone know something was coming. In front of the wrought iron gates of Harbor Eden, a luxury retirement resort designed for the aging elite, stood a man, alone. He looked nothing like the people in the brochures. No cashmere sweater, no sleek wooden cane, no satisfied smile beside a glass of red wine by the fireplace. Instead, he wore a weathered brown jacket, black sneakers worn down to the tread, and carried a frayed canvas bag. No paperwork, no formal introduction, just a temporary plastic name tag that read, Stanley. But that wasn't his real name. His name was Simon Alden, the founder and CEO behind the entire Harbor Eden system, and not a single person recognized him. Not the gatekeeper, not the front desk staff, not even the woman who had just given a half-hearted order over the intercom, telling him to go round back. "The service entrance is behind the building," the woman's voice rang out through the speaker. Not exactly rude, but stripped of warmth, like something she'd said 100 times before. Simon nodded, as if he really was the person they believed him to be. He walked slowly, unhurried, like someone counting his steps to hear something more important than a greeting. Inside the main building, the polished stone floor reflected his old shoes like a distorted mirror. He passed the reception desk, where a young woman was busy booking a spa appointment for a premium resident, not sparing a glance for the man who had just walked by, as if he were nothing but a passing breeze. No one noticed the mop in his hand. And honestly, why would they? People like him never got noticed. The staff room was bright but cold, the scent of lemon disinfectant lingering in the air like it hadn't quite cleared from the vents. A young employee named Bryce skimmed Simon with his eyes while holding a clipboard, never once looking up during the 10-minute orientation, which sounded more like a list of warnings than a welcome. "Stick to your assigned area. Don't speak with the residents. Stay out of the inner garden. If anything's broken, report it. Don't fix it yourself. Insurance doesn't like that. And don't draw attention. Got it?" Simon nodded. The mop in his hand was new, but the look in Bryce's eyes wasn't. Not to him. It was the same look given to thousands before him. Invisible. Not 10 minutes into his first shift, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. At the far end of the grand dining hall, decorated with etched glass, silk curtains, and the soft hum of jazz from a grand piano in the corner, an elderly woman was being blocked. Geneva Langston, mid-80s, a black woman with a proud stance, silver hair pinned neatly, and sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses. She wore a navy dress and white blouse, holding a book and a small canvas tote. A young receptionist, white, sharp, professional, stood in her path with a strained smile. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Langston, but this area is currently reserved for signature-tier residents only." Geneva didn't move. "I come here every Tuesday. Ruth and I meet at 11:30. We've done this for months." The young woman sighed as if speaking to a child. "Your friend is on the signature plan. You are not. That includes dining access. I'm just following protocol." Simon, who had been cleaning the windows nearby, paused. Geneva's voice remained calm. "My friend doesn't sort me by pricing tiers, and this place shouldn't either." Another staff member approached. Darren, older, seemingly the one brought in to handle situations. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "if you continue to raise your voice, we'll have to ask you to return to your room." Geneva hadn't raised her voice. She was just speaking, but clearly she made them uncomfortable, and that alone was enough to be seen as a problem. Simon gently set down the mop and stepped closer. "Excuse me, can I clean this area now? I don't want to be in the way." Darren turned to him, annoyed. "Your job is to mop the floors, old man. No one asked you to speak." Geneva looked at Simon. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, like she saw something not yet clear even to herself. She gave a small nod. Simon understood and backed away. But he didn't forget. By late afternoon, in the supply room behind the corridor, Simon sat alone with a bottle of water and a mop that now felt heavier than any asset he'd ever signed for. What he witnessed wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a symptom of a system that had gone off course. Harbor Eden, the dream of a place where the elderly would be honored and live fully, was slowly becoming a place that defined people by price tags and tier names. He had suspected it. Now he felt it. in every glance, every tone, every chilling formality. On his way to the East Wing, he overheard a tour guide leading a group of potential clients. All signature suites come with private balconies, concierge medical care, and exclusive access to the garden room, she said crisply. A man with a gold watch asked, "And the less fortunate ones?" The guide chuckled softly. "We try to bring kindness to every level." Simon stopped mid-mop. Kindness had levels now? In his mind, the phrase "being respected while aging" rang like mockery. In the employee dining room, he met Raya, a young woman with a simple ponytail and a faded nurse's uniform, gently spoon-feeding porridge to Mrs. Harland, an elderly woman seated alone in the corner. No one had told her to do it. No one seemed to care. "She doesn't like eating alone," Raya said as Simon approached. "Most of the elders here don't." "Do you ever get in trouble for this?" he asked. She smiled. "Only on Tuesdays." "Geneva." Simon took note. He asked gently, "You know Mrs. Langston?" "Of course. She used to be a teacher. Finishes a book every week. But around here, they don't see someone who built anything. They see a burden." Simon said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, while sweeping the grand lobby after the residents had gone to their rooms, Simon passed a wall plaque framed in gold lettering. "Aging with Grace." He stopped. Read it slowly. The words sounded beautiful, but empty without respect. Real respect. Not the kind based on money, skin color, or memory. The kind that doesn't vanish when someone walks slower. That isn't revoked when they stop signing checks. Simon Alden's first night under the name Stanley ended in silence, but it marked the beginning of a journey he would not back down from. He carried no hidden cameras, no wiretap, only memory, the kind forged by someone who once believed in something good and was now watching that very dream decay. Tomorrow he would mop the floors of the garden room, the very place Geneva was denied, not because it was dirty, but because he needed to feel, with his hands, his knees, his breath, just how deep the stain had sunk. The second day started earlier than expected. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the back end of Harbor Eden was already alive with the sound of rolling metal carts, the hiss of a coffee machine in the staff room, and the rhythmic tapping of plastic slippers against tile, like the heartbeat of a place that doesn't allow anyone to stop. Simon, or Stanley, according to the fake name tag, had been awake long before the shift bell rang. He didn't need an alarm, not at his age, not with his mind still spinning from the image of Geneva standing silently at the dining hall entrance the day before, with eyes that held no blame, no plea, just a look that made others feel ashamed for staying silent too long. Wing C was the least mentioned area in all the orientation briefings. It had no garden view, no modern art lining the walls. Even the carpet was thinner. Most of its residents had no family or financial sponsors. All they had was one thing: time and memories. But time moved slowly in Wing C, slow like something people had abandoned. And memory? Harbor Eden only valued that when it served a marketing campaign. Simon pushed his mop cart past a half-open door. Inside, an elderly black man was pouring tea, his hands trembling enough to spill a few drops. No one helped him. No one watched. He wore a beige sweater, worn at the elbows, the collar slightly wrinkled. Simon meant to pass quietly, but the old man spoke, voice soft but clear. "You the new guy?" Simon nodded. The man smiled. "Welcome to the wing where people forget there are still people living." He wasn't joking. He said it like stating a fact, and somehow that made it land even heavier. The common room in Wing C had an old wall-mounted TV, 2 fabric sofas with frayed corners, and a bookshelf where only one row held actual books. The rest were just empty boxes. Geneva was sitting there, reading a paperback novel, her legs neatly crossed atop a wooden table. She looked up as Simon passed, raising an eyebrow. "How long you planning to keep up the act?" Simon froze but said nothing. Geneva smirked. "I taught theater for 30 years. You won't fool me." Then she went back to her book. Simon felt something strange. In all of Harbor Eden, praised as a paradise for the elderly, it was that simple corner, the one occupied by the woman denied access to the luxury dining room, that felt the most alive. Bryce, the young supervisor who had assigned Simon his duties, showed up moments later, calling him out of Wing C with urgency. Don't spend too much time in there. No need to clean it thoroughly. They don't get visitors. Simon asked, playing dumb. But they're residents too, right? Bryce shrugged. On paper, yeah. But in practice, they're Tier B. Didn't they tell you? His tone was disturbingly casual, cold enough to chill the spine. Simon smiled faintly, not from satisfaction, but to mask the fury building inside. He glanced back at the hallway he'd just left, as if to remind himself, that's where justice is waiting. At lunch that day, in the grand lobby, staff were setting up a buffet table for a wine and wellness event exclusive to signature tier residents. Soft classical music played in the background. Fruit was carved into floral shapes. Servers wore white gloves, adjusting each wine glass to perfection. Meanwhile, back in Wing C, the lunch menu was reheated canned soup with cold sandwiches. No servers, no flowers, no one straightening water cups. Simon watched quietly, then returned to the supply closet, took out an old modified phone, untraceable, and recorded his voice. Day 2. Segregation isn't on paper anymore. It's in every detail, from tablecloths to glances. Here, people are categorized like menus, premium, and leftovers. That afternoon, he checked the 3rd floor, where rooms were labeled the Garden Suites. Each one had a private balcony, real plants, and the scent of essential oils softly diffused into the air. He passed a middle-aged woman giving her mother a tour. You've picked the right place, the consultant beamed. We even have a resident coordination team to ensure your mom's neighbors match her style, background, and energy. Simon stopped in the hallway. The phrase match her energy summed up everything he feared. A system designed to make the elderly feel safe, but that quietly installed an invisible ruler to measure who deserved what. Back in Wing C, he found Geneva again. She was sitting with a petite woman, her hair nearly all silver, clutching a photo album. This is Agnes, Geneva said. My best friend. She used to be a nurse in Alabama. Agnes nodded softly, then opened a page. A photo of her standing beside a newborn, face filled with pride. Simon asked, Is that your grandchild? Agnes replied slowly, No. It was the baby of a young orphan girl. I argued with the doctor to let her hold the baby before they took him away. I got in trouble, but it was worth it. Simon stared at that photo for a long time. One small act, one quiet decision, but it held an entire lifetime. And now Agnes had been filed away into the forgotten zone, just because no one visited her. Suddenly Bryce called out from behind, Stanley, don't hang around here. Go mop the signature hallway. They're filming for the marketing campaign. Simon looked at Geneva and Agnes one last time, then nodded and walked away. But this time, each step felt like it carried the weight of the entire building. That evening, while cleaning the spa area, where signature residents received peppermint oil treatments and hot stone massages, Simon noticed something odd. A small camera tucked behind a wall painting. No sign, no red light. He returned to the equipment room and asked an older technician named Martin. The man chuckled. Oh, those are for documenting. Marketing pulls clips from them for those heartwarming, happy senior life videos. They get tons of views. It's always smiling seniors. Simon said nothing. In his mind, he pictured those smiles. Not Geneva's, not Agnes's, but the ones carefully arranged to happen on cue, at the right angle, on the right floor. Before ending his shift, Simon walked past the staff break room. Inside, a few workers were laughing at the residents. Mrs. L wore her pajamas into the hallway again. Thought she was in Paris. Mr. M called me daughter and cried. I had to hide in the bathroom so I wouldn't laugh out loud. Simon said nothing. He just opened his locker, stored his tools, and wrote a note in his journal. When a society starts treating part of its population as entertainment, that society is deeply unwell. Night fell. Geneva was still reading in the common room under a dim light. Simon sat beside her, saying nothing. After a few minutes, she quietly said, This place could be as beautiful as it wants, but it means nothing if the people inside it are treated like they don't belong. Simon turned to her, and for the first time, he felt his vision blur. Tomorrow would be different. But tonight, he needed to remember that every system, whether built from diamonds or from stone, can rot from within if no one listens. The third morning at Harbor Eden began with rain. Not a heavy downpour, but a steady mist, like a fine veil of water brushed lightly across the glass hallways, connecting the signature wing and Wing C. Yet even that rain wasn't enough to soften the increasingly dense atmosphere settling over the middle floors, where Simon, still under the name Stanley, was about to step into another long day. Here he was no longer just a janitor. He had become something more, a deliberate observer. The fragments of truth were starting to take shape, and his mind, once a strategist's engine of leadership, now operated like a relentless recording device, capturing every moment, every word, every minor behavior like a silent journalist embedded within the retirement paradise he had once envisioned. But that now suffocated him. The blueprint he had drawn long ago for a peaceful sanctuary of aging was now being retraced by his own steps. Only this time, the colors were so bleak even he could hardly believe them. Raya appeared in the corridor like a small ray of light against the drab gray. Every time she walked, Simon noticed how silent her steps were, as if she had trained herself not to startle even those who napped lightly in their wheelchairs. That morning, she was tending to Mrs. Clark, a senior with moderate Alzheimer's. She often woke up in the middle of the night asking, "Where am I?" and sometimes called Raya by the name of her daughter, who had passed years ago. Raya never corrected her. She didn't redirect or dismiss her the way other staff often did. She simply sat down, held her hand, and replied, "I'm here." It wasn't a factual answer. It was a warm one. Simon stood nearby, pretending to check the supply shelf, but really just watching. After helping Mrs. Clark get dressed, Raya quietly changed the sheets, folded the old sweater, and tidied the bedside table without anyone prompting her. Each of her movements radiated a kind of precision not born from fear of making mistakes, but from something deeper, respect. At lunch, the break room felt different than the days before. A few staff members were laughing loudly about some old guy who fell on the front steps again, probably not the first time. As Simon entered, he saw Raya sitting in the corner, not eating, just holding a cup of lukewarm tea. He walked over to pour himself some water and gently asked, "Aren't you hungry?" Raya gave a small smile. "I studied to be a nurse, but I didn't expect to become someone who just endures." Simon sat beside her in silence. Raya continued, "I don't mind the hard work. I chose this, but I didn't choose how they treat the patients, like they're obstacles." Her voice wasn't angry, not bitter, just light, like a story being told. But maybe because of that, it landed even heavier. "They told me I lack administrative skills, so no raise. But I don't need paperwork skills to know when someone's afraid. When a hand squeeze works better than a sedative. When one small song can stop a man from hitting his head against the wall." Simon looked at her. Something in her eyes reminded him of his younger self. The feeling of knowing you're right, but having no power to act on it. That afternoon, Simon was assigned to help move residents from temporary care to long-term stay. A routine process, but for those being moved, it felt more like an unspoken migration. There he saw Raya again, assisting Mr. Jones, a partially paralyzed man, pack up his things. While two other staff members rushed him, Raya patiently helped him choose each item. "I know you like this scarf. You told me your wife gave it to you," she said. Jones smiled, eyes glistening. "You remembered?" Raya nodded. "I don't forget what matters." Simon stood there watching, then turned away, not because he wanted to leave, but because he didn't want anyone to see him holding back tears. That night, Simon sat alone in the corridor of Wing C. He opened his notebook and wrote slowly, line by line, Day 3. Raya has no title, no authority, no praise from upper management, but she is the only moral pillar I've seen here. A candle in the desert, and everyone acts like they don't see the light. He paused, gazing toward the end of the hall, where Geneva's room glowed faintly. In the window frame, her silhouette stood quietly, like a witness to it all. Simon realized something. If Geneva was the keeper of memory, Raya was the keeper of humanity. Later that night, during the late dinner hours when most residents had retired to their rooms, Simon saw Geneva and Raya sitting together in the reading corner, looking through a photo album. I used to teach in the South, Geneva said, her voice low but firm. Back then, if a black woman stood in front of a classroom, people would ask, "Who gave you permission to teach?" That question never left. They've just changed the words. Raya nodded. Here, they ask me, "Who gave you permission to care the way you do?" Different question, same meaning. Simon walked over, thinking he might slip away quietly, but Geneva called out, "Stanley, have you ever seen someone change something they had no power over?" Simon replied, "I used to think I had power. Then I forgot what it felt like not to." Geneva smiled. "Then maybe now's the time to remember." After they both left, Simon stood alone in the quiet room. He looked around, bookshelves, armchairs, lamps, all serene. But within that stillness, Raya's words lingered. "I don't forget what matters." Simon closed his eyes. In the days ahead, he would need to remember everything, every detail, every person, every look. Because to change something that's grown numb, someone first has to remember how it used to feel. The fourth day began with a strange kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses down, like everyone knows something's wrong, yet no one chooses to speak. Simon sensed it the moment he stepped in for the morning shift. In the supply room, the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer than usual. Bryce didn't toss his clipboard like he normally did. He just glanced at Simon over his shoulder and gestured quickly toward the spa. "There's an incident," he said, then disappeared. No explanation, no questions. But Simon, more accurately Stanley, was beginning to understand. At Harbor Eden, an incident wasn't something that caused chaos. It was something that made everything too quiet. Up in the third-floor spa, two employees were remopping the floor while someone from the internal media department was inspecting a small camera mounted high in the corner of the ceiling. No logo, no indicator light, no sign it was even there. Until yesterday, when a resident saw herself featured in a promotional video broadcast in the internal newsletter. A video she had never agreed to be filmed for. She called her son. Her son was a lawyer. And today, the camera was taken down. But no one apologized. No one acknowledged a mistake. There was only a sticky note posted on the staff bulletin board. "We need to be more cautious with brand imagery." Nothing about the residents. Nothing about consent. Just the brand. Simon stood quietly in the corner, mop in hand, eyes fixed on the camera as it was removed. In his mind, he replayed boardroom meetings from years ago. The day he approved giving the marketing department full control over visual content to enhance the sensory experience. The day he allowed clips of residents laughing to become the centerpiece of joyful aging campaigns. Back then, he believed everything was voluntary. He believed everyone had been asked. But now, in the shoes of someone no one bothered to ask, he realized consent is easy to assume, especially when no one has the power to refuse. That afternoon, Simon was assigned to mop the hallway leading to the conference room, where a new photo shoot was being set up for the Memories That Last campaign. A selected group of residents, mostly white, well-dressed, accompanied by family, hair neatly brushed, clothes freshly ironed, were gathered for the shoot. Geneva wasn't there. Agnes wasn't either. Mr. Jones sat alone in his dim room, never invited. Simon asked one of the assistants, "Who picks the list?" The assistant replied simply, "Marketing filters it. They pick people who film well, people who smile, people with a good story." Then she leaned toward another staffer and whispered, "Those other ones, they look too depressing on camera." Simon lowered his head, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew, if he started talking, he wouldn't be able to stop. Back in Wing C, Geneva sat alone in the reading room, eyes gazing out the window as the rain began to fall. "Did you see who put the camera up?" she asked without turning. Simon walked over and sat beside her. "Yes," he replied. "They took it down this morning." Geneva nodded. "I used to teach at a small school. They installed cameras to protect students, but eventually they used them to watch teachers. When I protested, they told me I didn't understand the times." She turned to look at Simon. "Some people use technology like a mirror. Others use it like a weapon." Simon didn't respond. He knew she was right, and he knew he had once laid his own hands on the blueprint of that very weapon. That evening, Simon went to inspect the hallway equipment near the back, where he'd heard cameras had once been installed but were now removed. Entering the temporary storage room, he found Raya standing in front of a small monitor, a USB stick in her hand. "I'm backing up the clip of Mr. Jones reading poetry last week," she said. "He asked me not to let it disappear. It was his first time reading out loud in nearly a year." Simon stepped closer to watch. On the screen was an old man, voice trembling, reciting a poem about the sea. No spotlight, no background music, just his voice and the truth. "I won't let anyone take it," Raya said. "This belongs to him, not to Facebook." Simon nodded, feeling a rush of something strange, like he had just been reminded of the original purpose he once believed in. Preserving what's real, not for profit, not for image, but for humanity. Before the shift ended, Simon passed by the staff lounge where Shelley, the media director, was sitting with Bryce reviewing edited footage. The clip showed an elderly woman coloring, with the caption, "Harbor Eden, where every memory is cherished." Simon recognized her. She had told him just yesterday that she no longer wanted to be filmed. He slowed his pace, listening as Shelley said, "She doesn't remember being filmed." "Alzheimer's, usable." Bryce laughed. "Still got the best smile." That line hit Simon like a cold blade to the chest. He left without a word, but inside a decision had crystallized. They would not be allowed to keep doing this. No one had the right to steal someone's memories and turn them into communal property without asking. No one had the right to exploit an elder's confusion for shares and engagement. Night fell, rain still tapping softly outside. Geneva, as usual, was reading, but this time not alone. Raya sat beside her, head resting gently against the back of her chair. Agnes dozed off nearby on the sofa. Simon entered quietly, saying nothing, and placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside were old photos of residents he had gotten permission to duplicate from the archive. Wedding pictures, graduation shots, baby photos. He didn't say which campaign they were for. He just said, "These are their pasts. They don't belong to the company. They belong to them." No one said a word, but everyone understood. A battle had begun, quiet, steady, and he, the man who once stood on big stages in a tailored suit holding a mic, was now restarting everything with a mop in his hand, and eyes that no longer looked away. The fifth morning began with the bitter smell of burnt coffee from the staff room and a yellow sticky note slapped on the announcement board with bold red italics. All staff must avoid interaction with residents outside of designated functions. No further explanation was given, but everyone understood. Someone had done something not by protocol. Simon stared at the note a few seconds longer than necessary, his entire body frozen as others passed him by. Beneath the jacket of Stanley, the aging man with a mop, beat the furious heart of someone who once thought he understood everything about the system he helped create. Now he knew he had been wrong. That morning, Geneva didn't appear in the reading room as usual. When Simon asked Raya, she shook her head. "She's been rescheduled," she said. "Didn't meet the image standard for friendly resident presentation." The way she said it made Simon's spine tingle. It was Bryce, the same Bryce, who made that decision after a potential investor visited Wing C and happened to overhear Geneva ask flatly, "If I move to signature, do I need to change my skin color too?" That question was never quoted anywhere, but its consequences were loud and clear. Simon was reassigned to mop the signature hallway during peak hours. When residents were dressed immaculately, staff served hot tea on silver trays, and every gaze had been trained to slide past anything unsightly. He kept his head low, gently mopping the narrow spaces along the baseboards, but his eyes remained alert. Then he heard heels stop next to him, followed by a voice he'd never forget. "Hey you can't mop right now. This is guest movement time. Your mop smells like chemicals." It was Shelley, head of image and media. Simon stood up, ready to explain, but before he could speak, she waved her hand. "Go back to your C wing. We don't need your kind here." In front of 3 signature residents and 2 receptionists, Simon, the same man who had once given keynote speeches at national elder care conferences, was dismissed like an out-of-place object. And what hurt more than the words was the way everyone else looked. Silent, indifferent, as if it was perfectly normal. He turned and walked away without responding. but each step felt like a question carved into the floorboards. When did kindness get replaced by the language of suitability? And who gets to decide what's suitable? Back in the supply room, Simon sat on the old wooden chair, peeled off his gloves, took a deep breath, and opened his notebook. He wrote, Day 5. I was called a janitor who smells like chemicals. No one asked my name. No one cared where I came from. And maybe if I collapsed today, they'd call someone, not to save me, but to sweep me away. That afternoon, he returned to Wing C to find Geneva, but she wasn't there. Agnes said quietly, they moved her meditation hour. Signature folks didn't like her presence. Then she shook her head. I don't understand. A place called home. Throwing someone out because they don't fit the look? Simon clenched his fist, struggling to stay composed. But something inside him was beginning to break. While mopping the side lobby, he overheard Bryce briefing a group of new staff. He pointed to a building diagram and said, Wing A is for display. Wing B is the buffer. Wing C, well, just think of it as the edge. Clean it, keep it out of sight. One trainee asked, what about the long-term care unit? Bryce shrugged. Oh, that's the Twilight Zone. Not much to say about that. Simon gripped his mop so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he let go and walked away. Because he knew, if he stayed, he wouldn't be able to keep up the act. That evening, he sat with Raya in the break room. She was folding shirts for a newly arrived resident, an elderly Asian man who didn't speak English and rarely made eye contact. He used to be an engineer, holds a patent, Raya said, but here they call him that weird old guy, because he doesn't smile when they mispronounce his name. Simon asked, who gave him that nickname? Raya looked up. Shelley, in a meeting. Everyone laughed. Simon nodded, not surprised, just sad. After his shift ended, Simon walked through the inner garden, the one always lit in soft yellow, the one used for those candid shots of signature residents featured in promotional materials. There he found Geneva sitting alone on a stone bench, a book in her hands, eyes less sharp than usual. I didn't see you today, she said softly. I was reassigned, Simon replied, voice steady. Geneva looked him in the eye. You don't need to explain, I saw it. Simon stayed quiet. Then she continued. You know what hurts most isn't that they dismissed me. It's that they teach young people to believe it's right. Simon sat beside her. Overhead, rain began to fall again, not hard but enough to make the leaves shiver. He said, I once thought a place like this would make the elderly feel valued, but I was wrong. It only makes the acceptable ones feel comfortable. Geneva didn't respond. She just handed him a small piece of paper, a poem she had just written. I used to teach letters. Now I'm judged by the color of my skirt. I used to have a voice. Now I'm taught to be silent. Simon took the paper and read it slowly. When he looked up, she was already walking into the dark. That night, back in his room, Simon opened his notebook and wrote the final line of the day. I was scolded in front of everyone. I was shooed away like a nameless object, but I've seen what I needed to see, and when the time comes, I won't wave them off. I'll raise my hand, and they will have to look. The rain that had started the night before hadn't stopped, and Friday morning at Harbor Eden carried a strange heaviness, like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something no one dared to say. Simon began his shift in the long-term care wing, a place rarely mentioned during tours and even more rarely seen in promotional videos. It sat at the lowest level, past 2 keypad locked doors, with no background music, no framed art. Only the hum of the aging ventilation system and the slow wheels of hospital beds gliding over cold stone floors. They called it the Twilight Wing, a poetic name for the place where memories had begun to leave the body, where most residents no longer remembered who they were, and where the system no longer cared to remember their names. Simon pushed his cleaning cart down the narrow hallway and stopped outside room 3B, where a small red light blinked above the door, signaling a resident needed assistance. Inside, an elderly man with white hair sat on his bed, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He muttered something so softly Simon had to step closer to hear. Where is it? The card with my son's signature. His voice trembled, as did his hands. No nurse was nearby. Simon bent down, picked up the fallen paper, and gently placed it back in the man's hands. What's your son's name? he asked quietly. The old man shook his head. I've forgotten. Simon didn't know what to say. He simply stood there, pulling the blanket back into place, adjusting the pillow behind the man's shoulders. For those few minutes, he wasn't a CEO, nor a janitor, just one human being facing another who was slowly disappearing. At the nurse's station at the end of the hall, Simon found Raya checking the medicine cabinet. She wore a thin gray sweater over her scrubs, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. Short-staffed today, she said quickly, continuing her task. Simon silently helped her push the medication cart. As they turned the corner into the main hall, they stopped abruptly. There sat Mr. Ellis, the former history teacher, alone in the middle of the lobby, head bowed, cradling a napkin folded into the shape of a heart, scrawled on it in shaky marker, "Meet my son at 10 a.m." There was no one else. No sun. No clock showing 10 a.m. Just him, and a promise that may never have been made. Raya knelt beside Mr. Ellis and gently took his trembling hand. "Your son's busy today," she said softly, "but I can sit in his place if that's okay." Mr. Ellis didn't answer, but tears began to fall. Simon turned away, not to avoid it, but because he didn't want anyone to see his own tears. After helping Raya walk Mr. Ellis back to his room, Simon stepped into the small utility closet behind a silver door. In the faint flicker of the fluorescent light, he opened his notebook and carefully wrote, Day 6. I saw a man wait for someone who would never come, and another who stepped in, not out of duty, but out of kindness. He paused, then stared at the blank wall where a framed Employee of the Month certificate used to hang, now removed. No one here is called by name, he continued. Only numbers, shifts, medical charts. But I've seen their names, not on paper, but in their actions. That afternoon, Bryce held a staff meeting, instructing everyone to avoid close interactions with residents, especially those no longer cognitively aware. The reason given, to preserve professionalism and limit liability. Simon stood in the back of the room, hands tightening involuntarily. Bryce ended with, We're staff, not friends. They won't remember you anyway. The room stayed silent. No one argued. No one nodded. Just a growing numbness in the air. After the meeting, Simon returned to Geneva's room. She wasn't there. Agnes whispered, She's writing a letter. Said if they won't let her speak, she'll write. Simon nodded. She always knew how not to stay silent. In the rear hallway, he found Geneva sitting alone, writing on a cream-colored sheet of paper, dim lamplight casting soft shadows on her slanted handwriting. She didn't look up. Today I'm writing to someone without a name, she said. An old man who's only referred to by his room number. I don't know what he used to do, but I know that when I held his hand, he squeezed back. And that's enough. That night, Harbor Eden rested under soft nightlights. But in the smallest room on the lowest floor, Simon remained awake. He sat on the ground, back against a cabinet, eyes staring into the distance. The day's images replayed in his mind like a slow-motion reel. Mr. Ellis's eyes, Raya's hands, Geneva's turning pages, Bryce's hollow voice. Then he quietly pulled out an old photograph, the only one he had brought with him. In it, a younger Simon stood next to his late father, outside an old care home in Minnesota. His father had once said, Growing old isn't scary. What's scary is no one remembering who you were. Simon had forgotten that, but not anymore. He closed the notebook, stood up, and picked up his mop. Tomorrow would be Saturday, and he knew. Tonight, no one would call his name, but he was ready to make sure they'd remember. Saturday morning, Harbor Eden seemed to wake up wearing a mask. The staff smiled more than usual. The main lobby was sprayed with cinnamon and apple scent, the fragrance of the weekend, according to the internal event calendar. A violinist had been invited to perform in the garden room. Herbal tea was served on silver trays. On the handwritten events board near reception, a delicate script read, Today's theme, harmony. But to Simon, it was all just a curtain, thick enough to cover the rot beneath. And he was beginning to feel it clearly. There are stains a mop cannot clean. Some stains come from neglect. Bryce assigned Simon to the auxiliary reception area, where most weekend family visits took place. There, Simon witnessed carefully staged performances, signature residents being lifted onto velvet cushioned chairs by grandchildren, staff rushing to place shawls over shoulders, and compliments floating through the air like soap bubbles. Meanwhile, in Wing C, the rare visits were confined to resident rooms. No tea, no cookies, no one smiling. Simon felt like he was living in two overlapping worlds, separated by a single door. On one side, presentation. On the other, truth. At noon, back in the supply room, he found Raya organizing her medical bag. Her eyes looked more tired than usual. "Something wrong?" he asked. Raya glanced around, then replied, "I just got reprimanded." Her voice wasn't angry, just worn out. "They said I've been spending too much time with residents without sponsor families. They told me to focus on those who are communicable for media purposes." Simon nodded. He wasn't surprised, but what hurt him was the look in Raya's eyes. Not because she'd been criticized, but because she was starting to doubt herself. "I'm beginning to forget what's right anymore," she whispered. "I just know that when I sit with Mr. Ellis, he doesn't shake. When I say Mrs. Harlan's name correctly, she laughs. But none of that shows up on any KPI." Simon stepped closer and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "The right thing rarely comes with a paycheck," he said, "but it's worth more than any contract." Raya said nothing, but in her eyes a flicker returned, not of hope, but of resolve. That afternoon, Shelley held a mandatory workshop on rules for inspirational interaction. All staff were required to attend, except Simon. He wasn't part of the guest-facing team. While the group was learning how to smile in brand alignment, Raya asked to be excused for a headache. Simon saw her in the hallway. She handed him a small folded piece of paper. "If I'm not here tomorrow, give this to Geneva," she said quickly, then walked away. Simon unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten list, 10 residents with incomplete records, no family, no financial sponsors, no photographs in their files. Beside each name, Raya had written a short note. "Mr. Ellis, former teacher, loves poetry. Mrs. Harlan, likes jasmine tea. Mr. Liu, engineer, speaks Mandarin." Simon read every line, then tucked the paper inside his coat pocket. It was a list not found in any system. It was a list of human beings, people who, if no one remembered, would vanish as if they never existed. That evening, as Simon made his rounds through the care wing, he noticed Raya was gone. Other nurses said she'd been given a break from the night shift. The reason? Breach of behavioral conduct. Simon understood immediately. He went to Geneva's room and handed her the paper from Raya. She read it slowly, then looked up. "I once told a student of mine, if you're not allowed to speak at the blackboard, write on the desk instead." Raya just did that. Simon nodded. Then he said, "I think it's time the forgotten names were read aloud." Before ending his shift, he returned to the supply room and opened his notebook, writing slowly, "Day 7. The only person brave enough to remember the forgotten was just reprimanded. But she left behind something no one can erase, names and memory." He closed the notebook and stood. Outside, the sky was darkening, but inside him, something had begun to glow. Not bright, not sudden, but steady, like a nightlight in the room of a lonely elder, small but unextinguished. Sundays at Harbor Eden were given a special name on the internal event calendar. Sunday. Not because of the sunshine, Hamilton Ridge remained overcast and drizzly, but because it was the designated day for senior executives and investors to make their scheduled surprise visits. They called it a walk-through with warmth, a term Shelley herself coined, meant to imply that residents, staff, and even the physical environment should emit positivity, not too theatrical, but definitely not solemn. Directional signs were replaced. Cinnamon cookies were placed on every guest table. Signature Wing residents were encouraged to wear Harbor Eden branded sweaters, while residents in Wing C were encouraged to remain in their rooms for safety and guest experience purposes. As Bryce explained, eyes fixed on the checklist app on his tablet. Simon, still known as Stanley, was assigned to the reception area in Wing B, the border between Signature and Wing C. A true gray zone, not polished enough to be photographed, not run down enough to ignore. He wiped down doorknobs, adjusted floor mats, straightened a crooked potted plant. Everything was fine, in the language of those holding a perfect surface together. But inside him, something had started to shift. like the first click of train wheels returning to the track after sitting still for far too long. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the directors arrived. 11 of them, 5 men, 6 women, all dressed in light shirts and soft blazers, the unofficial uniform of those who manage collective emotion. They walked in pairs, steps in sync, smiles measured, none carrying a notebook. They weren't here to learn. They were here to validate. Shelley led the group, iPad in hand, smiling constantly. The second floor just got LED lighting upgrades. Warmer tones help residents feel more comfortable during dinner, she said with the enthusiasm of someone advertising a scented candle. A female director nodded. Wonderful. Smells less like disinfectant than last time. Shelley turned to Simon, not recognizing him, and said loudly, "This janitor's doing an excellent job today. Floors are sparkling. Thank you." Simon smiled and bowed. He received the compliment like a slap, because no one knew who he was, and because he once convinced them that a polished floor could cover a bruised heart. When the group passed Wing C, they didn't stop. Shelley said quickly, "That wing's under maintenance. No need to go in." Geneva stood in her doorway watching. Simon stood behind her, unable to signal. Agnes sat inside, unaware. In those few seconds, Simon felt himself erased, not with violence but with deliberate omission. A young director leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "I still think Wing C should be converted into storage. Not worth the investment anymore." The other nodded. "We're building a new West Tower anyway. Cutting this makes sense." The group moved on. The smiles stayed in place. Shelley stayed in front. Simon stayed bowed. But inside, the anger that had once simmered now burned. That afternoon, Geneva invited Simon in for tea. "Did they see me?" she asked. Simon shook his head. "They looked through you." Geneva sipped her tea, then said, "I used to teach civic rights. I know what silent dismissal looks like. It's not a slap. It's an eye that doesn't stop, an ear that pretends not to hear, a smile that never lands on me." Simon didn't know what to say. He quietly pulled Raya's handwritten list from his pocket and placed it on the table. Geneva stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, "If we don't read these names out loud, who will?" By evening, the directors had departed. Shelley gave a closing speech at the reception desk. Today was a success. The system ran smoothly. Residents were pleased. Leadership commends the team's professionalism. No one applauded, because no one believed it. Simon silently wiped down a side table, each word falling like acid drops onto the calloused skin of his resolve. He knew. Something had to happen. That night, Simon went to Raya's room, the small one at the end of the hall. The lights were off, the door locked. On the handle was a note, "Temporarily suspended, return date unknown." He took the paper and clenched it. A sound behind him made him turn. Geneva stood there. "I know," she said. "They suspended her for writing down things that weren't in the report." Simon nodded. "We need to speak." Geneva looked at him for a long time, then asked, "Who are you going to speak to?" Simon didn't answer, but inside him, another question thundered louder. If I stay silent one more day, do I still deserve to be anyone at all? Monday came without a single greeting. There was no weekly staff meeting, no cinnamon cookies at the reception table, no cheerful email wishing everyone a good start to the week. Everything unfolded as if Harbor Eden had quietly slipped into an alternate rhythm, where silence was the unspoken agreement, and absence only needed a vague excuse to be accepted and ignored. Simon began his shift with a strange feeling. Not fatigue, not anger, but something more like walking through an old house where someone had rearranged the furniture overnight. Everything was still there, but nothing felt the same. Wing C was eerily quiet. The lights were dimmer than usual. Geneva's door was slightly ajar. She sat frozen in front of an open book, not turning the page, not sipping her tea. As Simon stepped in to ask, she spoke first, her voice flat. "Agnes is gone." It wasn't a metaphor. Agnes, the petite woman, Geneva's closest friend, the one who once proudly showed off a photo of a stranger's baby-like treasure, was simply no longer in her room that morning. No one had informed anyone. No one said goodbye. Her bed was neatly made, the sheets tucked in as if no one had ever slept there. Simon rushed to the internal records office. the department that oversaw resident relocation schedules. But when he asked, the intake clerk replied coldly, "She's been reassigned. That information is not within your access level." Not within your access level. A person, a life, a memory, reduced to administrative terminology so sterile it bordered on cruelty. He returned to Wing C. Geneva was still in the same position. On the table sat an old photo, her and Agnes in a kitchen, both smiling, holding a tray of bread. "We used to work in the cafeteria at the high school. I washed vegetables. She spread the butter. She spent her life taking care of others. But no one ever asked what she wanted," Geneva murmured. "And now, no one asked where she went." Simon said nothing. He turned and walked slowly to the supply room, fists clenched, his steps heavy like they carried stone. What filled him now wasn't fury anymore. It was a deeper kind of pain, the helplessness of someone who once had power, once had a title, once ruled an entire empire, and now couldn't stop one gentle old woman from being deleted by the press of a button. That afternoon, he discreetly approached the IT tech, a young guy named Devin who frequently repaired the office printer. Simon, in the guise of a weary janitor, sat beside him near the old copy machine. "I'm looking for information about a resident who was moved without formal notice," he said quietly. Devin looked up, skeptical, but then nodded. "Name?" Simon handed him a slip of paper. "Agnes Foster." Devin typed, scanned the screen. "She's listed as transferred to the Riverbend branch, but there's no transfer code, no transit log either." Simon asked, "What does that mean?" Devin's voice dropped, and for the first time he looked uneasy. "It could mean she was moved off the system. She might have been sent to holding." "What's holding?" Simon asked. Devin didn't answer, but his eyes said enough. That night, Geneva didn't read. She placed the photo of Agnes on the table, picked up a fountain pen, and wrote a single line. She lived here. Then she taped it to the wall outside her door. A small piece of paper, a stubborn act, a declaration from someone refusing to forget. The next day, the paper was gone. Shelley claimed it violated the residential aesthetic guidelines. Geneva didn't respond, but Simon couldn't stay silent anymore. He opened his notebook and wrote the first line with a trembling hand. Day 8. A human being can be erased and no one has to sign anything. He paused. For the first time since beginning his journal, his hand shook so badly the words came out crooked. He knew, if he didn't act now, Agnes wouldn't just become another forgotten resident. She would become precedent for hundreds more. That night he went to see Geneva. He handed her a notebook. Inside was Raya's original list of residents, now expanded by Simon to include birth dates, habits, and personal memories. "We need to read these names," he said. Geneva looked up at him, and for the first time used his real name, Simon. The word floated in the air like a summons. No more pretending, no more avoidance. "Then we'd better start," she said. Tuesday morning, the sun unexpectedly broke through over Hamilton Ridge. After nearly a week of drizzle and gray skies, sunlight streamed through Harbor Eden's windows as if someone had pulled back the heavy curtain of silence that had hung over the place. But for Simon, it wasn't a sign of blessing. It was exposure. Because today was the official internal launch of Harbor Eden 2.0, a ceremony unveiling the rebranding initiative, expansion plans, and selection of core leadership for the next generation of management. Shelley personally sent printed invitations to all department heads, senior staff, and of course the executive board. The invitations were printed in color, embossed, and ended in bold capital letters. Mandatory attendance, dress professionally, bring positive energy. Simon, as always, was not invited, but he was ready for something no one saw coming. The event took place in the third-floor auditorium, formerly a small chapel before it was restructured to align with brand strategy. Chairs were arranged in long rows, LED screens hastily mounted, projectors tested since 8 a.m. to avoid technical issues. A coffee and pastry station sat neatly in the back, available only to invited guests. Geneva, Raya, and the residents of Wing C weren't on the list. Agnes still hadn't returned. Simon arrived at 9:40 a.m., wearing his familiar worn brown coat, an old maintenance badge around his neck, and holding his mop. No one stopped him. No one asked what he was doing there. Because to them, he was invisible, and that allowed him to do the unthinkable. Step directly onto the stage, behind the podium, just as Shelley was adjusting the mic for the new head of communications. Before anyone could register what was happening, his voice rang out, low, steady, slicing through the air like a thin blade. My name is Simon Alden. I am not a janitor. I am not someone who needs to be told where to mop, who to avoid, or when to smile on cue. The room froze. Shelley stood in place, her face drained, mouth half open in stunned silence. I am the founder of Harbor Eden, the one who laid the first brick for this place, the one who once believed that growing old wasn't a journey into forgetting, but a time when people should be remembered the most. A director in the front row stood up. Is this some kind of joke? Simon turned toward him. This is a declaration and a confession. I confess that I allowed the system I created to become a machine of erasure. I confess that I sat through meetings where no one asked about those without family, without a flattering file, without a photogenic smile. I confess that I believed a marketing campaign could replace human presence. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Raya's handwritten list, held it high. This is a list of the people no one remembers, and today I'm reading their names. His voice didn't shake. His hand didn't falter. One by one, the names rang out. Ellis, Harland, Liu, Agnes, Geneva. They are not room numbers. They are not data entries. They are memory. And we've tried to delete them like we delete a file from a computer. The auditorium stood still. No one took a photo. No one live-streamed. No one dared to leave their seat. Because in that moment, truth weighed more than any press release. Simon continued, Raya, the only nurse brave enough to write down what the system refused to see, was suspended for doing the right thing. Geneva, a woman who once taught civic studies, was rescheduled because her outfit didn't match an investor's expectations. And Agnes, a nurse who cared for countless lives, was removed without a single written note. He paused, locking eyes with the executive row. Today, I'm not asking for resignations. I'm asking you to listen. From behind the stage, Geneva stepped out, holding a notebook filled with stories written by residents. She didn't speak. She simply opened the book. Projected on the screen were fragments. An old man reading poetry. A woman telling a story about her late husband. A man who couldn't remember his son's name, but still remembered the lullaby his mother used to sing. These were the clips Raya had saved. No color correction, no music overlay, just the truth. Shelley stood motionless. Bryce had already slipped out of the room. Some staff began to cry. Some directors lowered their heads. Simon ended the announcement with a single sentence, one that would later be carved into a wooden plaque hung in Wing C. If we cannot remember the names of those who once lived here, then none of us deserve to be remembered at all. The morning after the announcement, Harbor Eden was no longer the place Simon had once entered as an invisible man with a mop. The halls no longer smelled of artificial orange essential oil meant to fake tranquility, but instead carried the scent of antiseptic, fresh printed paper, and reform. Documents being reviewed line by line, as if someone had finally decided to open the doors that had long remained shut for the sake of someone else's convenience. There were no trumpets, no announcements over the loudspeaker. No one took selfies in front of a Harbor Eden 2.0 sign, but changes had quietly begun, and each one felt like a real sweep, not of polished floors, but of deep-rooted systems. At 8:14 a.m., Bryce was placed on temporary suspension. The notice came from HR, signed by Simon Alden, his real name, used in the system for the first time since his disguise. The stated reason, internal discrimination policy violation. Shelley did not show up at the office that morning. Rumors spread that she had requested unpaid leave for personal reasons. But Simon knew the truth. She had been offered a quiet exit, no press, no drama, in exchange for preserving her professional reputation. A soft landing, but in Simon's view, the only way to stop a system from disguising silence with carefully filtered microphones. Meanwhile, Geneva, the one who had once been reassigned for not fitting the brand image, was now appointed to lead the Memory Transmission Program, a new initiative co-proposed by Simon and Raya, aimed at documenting the lives of forgotten residents, not with reports but through stories, Old photos, voices, and tiny, irreplaceable human details no audit ever preserves. The community room in Wing C was renamed the Memory Room. No new armchairs, no velvet drapes, but there were writing desks, recorders, photo frames, and, most importantly, people willing to listen. Raya returned that afternoon. There was no applause, no welcome banner. But when she walked into the break room, every staff member stood, not by order, but because, for the first time, they were looking at someone with moral authority, not a title. Simon met her in the hallway. They didn't shake hands. She simply said, "They're listening." He nodded. "Because you never stopped speaking." Simon continued walking the halls, not to inspect cleanliness, but to see people. Mr. Ellis was brought back to the main lobby each morning, accompanied by the same poem he once recited, now engraved on a wooden plaque. Mrs. Harlan had someone helping her start a podcast called The Day I Met My First Love. Mr. Liu was called by his proper name in Mandarin. A new Chinese-speaking staff member had been hired just for him. All of it, each small act, was how Simon began his final cleanup. No soap, no chemicals, just memory. Geneva proposed abolishing the resident class system. Simon didn't just agree, he personally removed the signature suite plaque from Wing A. In its place, a new sign was hung. A home is where no one is priced. Rooms were renamed after trees, no tiered values. The phrase signature resident was deleted from all materials. Shelley had once said, "Class makes things professional." Simon now answered with action. It's the simple things that make them meaningful. By late afternoon, he stood on the rooftop, a place that had once been off limits to Wing C residents. Now Geneva and two other elderly women were sitting there reading. No one gave orders. No one submitted reports. Just sunlight, a soft breeze, and the sound of older voices laughing. Simon walked over. No need for introduction. Geneva waved. "You don't have to pretend to be Stanley today." He replied, "I still am Stanley, but I'm also Simon. Maybe I need both to remember why I came here." That night, he sat alone in the old utility room, where the mop still leaned against the wall. He no longer needed it, but he didn't throw it away, because it served as a reminder that real cleanliness isn't about shiny floors. It's about how people treat each other when no one is watching. He opened his notebook and wrote the final line of the day. "I am no longer a CEO. I am a witness. And now I choose to be a doer." The page closed, but the change had only just begun. By Wednesday noon, the air at Harbor Eden was so still you could hear the breeze brushing through the back garden, a space that, just 1 week ago, residents from Wing C were reminded was reserved for scheduled photo shoots. Now Geneva sat on a stone bench along the gravel path, holding the first printed copy of a book titled They Once Lived Here, a collection of small memories, everyday stories, and personal fragments of each resident the system once tried to erase. The cover was plain, with just one line printed in soft brown ink. No one forgotten. There was no company logo on the spine. No author's name, because everyone was the author, and no one was the brand. Simon stepped out from the hallway of Wing C, where he had just signed the final draft of a policy overhaul converting the resident classification system into the memory community model, in which all rooms held equal value, and every employee, from nurse to supervisor, was now required to complete a deep listening training before formally beginning their roles. It wasn't a weekend workshop. Beginning their roles. It wasn't a weekend workshop. It was the first mandatory rule he had written not to control anyone, but to protect those no longer able to speak for themselves. In the common room, Agnes, the woman who had once been removed without warning, sat in a circle of residents holding a small microphone. She had returned 3 days earlier after Simon personally intervened and uncovered that internal reassignment was a euphemism used as a soft deletion for those management didn't know how to categorize. She didn't speak much, but today she told a story. The time she hid a child from an abusive stepfather. The time she used her paycheck to buy a birthday cake for a forgotten nursing home patient. No one told her to speak. No one paid her for it, but everyone listened like each word was a missing piece of something sacred. In the main hallway, where a sign once read, "Signature Lounge," There was now a wooden wall covered with hundreds of handwritten notes. Each resident was invited to describe themselves in their own words. No character limit, no approval required. Some wrote simple lines. I'm a wife who loved a man for 60 years. Some sketched their childhood home. Some wrote nothing at all, just pinned an old handkerchief, signed with a trembling line of ink. No one laughed. No one rushed past. Everyone paused, at least for a second, because for the first time in a long time, memory was no longer a burden. It was an asset. Geneva proposed a new tradition, not on any government calendar. The Day of Names. On that day, once a year, Harbor Eden would turn off all branded music, pause all marketing activity, and dedicate the full day to residents and staff, calling out the names of those who had lived, worked, or left their mark on the space, even those no longer in the system. Simon didn't just approve. He proposed expanding it to all 40 Harbor Eden facilities across the country. We've had enough days celebrating CEOs, he said. Now it's time to honor those who never made it onto the brochures. That afternoon, Simon returned to the old utility room, where the mop still stood quietly by the wall, like a witness. He no longer needed it for disguise, but he didn't discard it, not out of nostalgia, but because it reminded him that real cleanliness was never about the shine of the floor, but how people treated each other when no one was watching. From the drawer, he pulled out a small wooden plaque engraved with Stanley's room, the one who saw. He hung it on the door and walked away without looking back. On his way out to the courtyard, he passed a small group of residents being led on a walk by a newly hired staff member. The young man didn't speak much. He walked slowly. He listened. He nodded. One elderly woman with silver hair asked, "What's your name, dear?" He replied, "I'm Kai." She smiled. "Well then, Kai, thank you for not rushing." As the sun set behind the glass conservatory, Geneva stepped beside Simon, handing him another printed copy of the book. "I think you should have one," she said. "I think you need to remember, you didn't come back because this place was broken. You came back because it was worth it." Simon didn't respond. He opened the book and read a short passage, one written by Mr. Ellis, the man who had waited for his son in vain. "I don't remember my son's face, but I remember the way he used to call me Dad. And today I heard that voice again, in someone named Raya." That night, Harbor Eden held no parties, no spotlights, only the soft glow from resident windows, where each person was now free to keep their lights on however they wished. No permission needed, no brand color calibration required, and outside the wind gently stirred the handwritten notes on the wooden wall. "I lived here. I still remember. I'm not a room number. I am part of this memory." Simon stood still, and for the first time since his journey began, he exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from knowing that what had once been hidden was finally being seen. He no longer had to play a part. He only had to do what was right. Some stories will never be printed in books. Some people will never sit in boardrooms, but they, the ones who mop floors, who hold spoons, who remember the names of pain, are the ones who preserve the real soul of a community. And sometimes it takes someone stepping back, playing invisible, to remind the world that the forgotten deserve to be called by name. If you've ever had a loved one in a nursing home, if you've ever worked a job no one notices, or if you've ever felt like a small, fragile piece inside a giant system, let this story remind you. You matter, and you deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment below. Who is your someone you'll never let be forgotten? Like if you saw yourself in this story. Subscribe to help preserve the things no one remembers, but everyone needs.